Many a fair word to you, my friends and fellow compatriots of Internet learning. I've talked at some length now about the nature of religion, ideology, and all the constituent components thereof, insofar as their relation to society and politics. And in all that monologuing, I've come to two major conclusions. One, that Albert Einstein was right to say that human stupidity is infinite. And two, that the overwhelming majority of human enmity boils down to either A, a disparity of interests between the involved parties, or B, a disconnect between the practical goals and abstract ideals of the same. And as I'm sure you've gathered from the title, it is the latter I mean to unpack for you in this session. If you've taken an economics class, you'll be well acquainted with basic concepts like supply and demand and the supply chain. For those who haven't, here's an illustrative diagram I sketched up. I should note that it is the kindergarten version of the system, but it's as much resolution as should be required to understand my point. For those who prefer not to have to read a video, the TLDR is the three most major nodes of the chain. The producers, distributors, and consumers mean exactly what they sound like they do. The producers make the products and services, consumers buy those products for their own use, and the distributors bring said products from the producers to the consumers. All in all, fairly self-explanatory. However, there's two big outliers on this board that your Econ 101 teacher probably forgot to tell you about: the marketers and the investors. Now, investing is its own separate barrel of monkey turds, which I have neither the expertise nor the desire to dig into. I'd personally recommend Veritasium's video explaining the concept of financial leverage, or else go check out the channel Cold Fusion, whose whole shtick is breaking open cans of legal and fiscal jargon to then serve as properly digestible morsels for the average layperson, a style which I do my best to emulate. But I digress. All I need you to understand for right now is that investors own portions of companies, called stock shares, which then either gain or lose value as the company does. Now, the marketer's job is to convey consumer demand back to the producers so that they can produce products that the end consumers actually want to purchase. These then fall to the marketers again to advertise to the consumer. The back and forth between the supply and demand portions can be thought of as analogous to a piston of an internal combustion engine. When all aspects of it work in tune and tempo with each other, the whole system moves forward with fluid precision. And indeed, this is how most economists tend to think about economic motors. But there's a huge critical oversight in this conception. You see, the individual components of an actual car's engine won't actively work to sabotage one another in order to secure a greater portion of the fuel, which would translate to money in this analogy. But people do so all the damn time. This fact is the foundational bedrock of capitalism. It is the grease that makes both society and nature as a whole function, and it is also the source of all the ideological gunk that invariably clogs the otherwise immaculately smooth system's gears. For those of you who haven't seen my other videos regarding ideology, the short and simple gist is that I've defined ideology as being separate from religion by its claiming to possess an infallible, foolproof blueprint for utopia, whereas a religion purports to have the same for an ideal character, i.e., one claims to produce the perfect world, while the other claims to produce the perfect person. And for this reason, I've lumped them both under the categorical banner of idealism. But why, you may ask, am I bringing up ideology in the same video as economics? Well, if you've the faintest semblance of understanding, or if you've merely observed the state of our modern society with any amount of practical resolution on either front, then the answer should be as painfully obvious as a barbed spike through your eye. To put it in brief, capitalism, insofar as is meant the free and open exchange of capital within a society, when you get right down to it, is just economic Darwinism, subject to all the same forces and pressures as genetic evolution. The problem is that many people, whether for personal, prejudicial, or genuinely principled reasons, bear strong moral objections to the natural order and are very often prepared to use those idealistic arguments as cudgels to clear their own paths through life. While on the other side of the coin, those pragmatists who defend the way things work as the way they ought to be will very rarely fail to fall into the same trap of conflating naturality with moral correctness, which you shouldn't have to be a biologist or a philosopher to find ethical fault with. As I have said often, and will continue to stand by so long as I believe it remains true and relevant, people, and hence society, are propelled by incentives, not narratives. It is what people want, not what they believe to be factually correct, that will determine their behavior. Going back to my little diagram again for a moment, recall how investors make their money. You'll notice the disconnect between them and the end consumer. This is because they own the means of production and distribution, and so have absolute control over the supply portion of the supply chain. But that doesn't amount to anything if the consumer refuses to buy the products they're selling. And so the investors rely on the marketers to convince the consumer to want, to demand, as it were, access to the products and/or services which are friendlier to their bottom lines, and so increase the investors' profit margins and the marketers' share of socio-political influence. However, as we are slowly but surely starting to teach these would-be social alchemists, the powers that be are no more or less than an elaborate form of hypnotism, one which only works when the recipient either is unaware that it's happening or has been thoroughly cowed into accepting the message as the one true form of good, whether in the moral or natural sense, is just arbitrary semantics. And herein lies the most common point of failure, as far as I see, of the human ecosystem. You cannot teach or browbeat a sheep into desiring a cut of bacon, nor cajole it out of a desire for sleep or a place within the protective body of its herd. Sure, you can force it to imbibe just about anything if you starve it for long enough, but a starving sheep produces little, if any, wool. So it is in the shepherd's best interest to tend to his flock's actual needs, not command them to take on his own wants as equivalent substitutes. The reason I say this is the most common and not the most critical point of failure is because an ideological infection, unlike nearly all other forms of man-made or natural disaster, can not only be avoided, but actually potentially reversed if recognized and reacted to intelligently at an early enough stage. The reason it is the most common is precisely because it is usually not even identified until it has become terminal. So what then is an ideological infection? Quite simply, it is when a significant portion of a system or institution's populace substitutes the practical needs of the system with their own idealistic fantasies, i.e., they try to force the system to work in ways it physically cannot because they believe it should. Example: the government says everyone should have 3 square meals a day regardless of income, so they look at the census data and order farmers to produce enough food in order to fulfill that quota, whether the market conditions are conducive to this or not. And since, contrary to the communists' belief, the government cannot magically create the requisite incentives out of thin air, they have to subsidize the farmer's unnatural growing pattern, which either causes taxes or inflation, or both, to skyrocket, which engorges living costs across the board, and so results in a full economic depression rather than the post-capital utopia the ideological zealots straddling the peak of the socio-economic mountain all imagined it would do. And before anyone jumps over any sharks in the comments, it's not just the neo-Marxists that fall victim to the trap of supposing their pretty little fantasy for hard reality. All supposed final solutions, when allowed to stew in a vacuum for long enough, will inevitably reach a point of circuitously presupposing their own conclusions as self-evident reality. But I've already done plenty of ranting about that elsewhere. And with that red flag flying tauntingly in the wind, I think that's where I'll let that thread lay for the time being. Until next time, stay safe, stay sane, remember to check out my books and vote in the community poll, etc., etc., and keep your eyes and mind wide open. Hasta la vista, baby.